coastal defense now exposed by vanishing Atlantic sand dunes.
It might seem like the Americans were being paranoid. I mean, who's going to attack the U.S. on the Delaware Coast, the Jersey Shore? But in fact, America was attacked.
The stranded remains of a town that once appeared to have it all.
They must have felt like they had found a Garden of Eden, an oasis in this dry zone. But someone with more authority wanted it for themselves.
Ruins on a tranquil Japanese bay with a deadly technology at their heart.
Were they doing something secret? Were they doing something dangerous? There are stories here in these buildings.
And a network of abandoned structures that cover an entire country.
It looks as though this land has been carpet bombed with these mysterious-looking domes. You find them in the roadsides, in churchyards, in people's gardens. You have to wonder who or what were they protecting themselves from?
Decaying relics, ruins of lost worlds. Forged through years of toil, now haunted by the past. Their secrets waiting to be revealed. Albania, a country on the fringe of modern-day Europe, a land covered in peculiar mushroom-shaped structures.
There are these weird little constructions, and they're all over the place. There's no pattern to it, there's no restriction to them.
It is a bizarre situation where you have every village and every field almost is covered with these things.
They're carved into mountainsides and spread along the coast, looking out to sea.
They're everywhere. Everywhere.
These tiny structures appear to be fortified.
The sheer volume and positioning of them tells you that a huge force or population was expected to mobilize and defend this land.
Every now and again, you come across a bigger structure, one with more rooms, more defensive capability. Somehow, there must be a system, there must be a way that everything is linked.
Albania is riddled with these places. But a post-apocalyptic landscape at the heart of this nation suggests the worst-case scenario may have come to pass.
A vast complex covering an area that goes as far as the eyes can see. All that remains is just a ghost town.
This place wouldn't look out of sorts in the dystopian world of Mad Max or Blade Runner.
So what happened behind the heavy iron curtain that once shrouded Albania? Elton Corshi, a local historian and tour guide, grew up here. These structures made unusual playgrounds.
You could find them everywhere. It was great to play outside, actually.
But there was a serious side to them.
This is what we call mushroom bunkers. Hundreds of thousands of these were built all around the country, mainly focusing on the coastal areas, since D-Day style of attack was expected to come this way.
Throughout the 1970s, the Albanian population was ready to mobilize at a moment's notice and use the mushroom bunkers to defend the nation against the most terrifying attacks.
There was this constant, genuine fear of the attack, and I do remember the trainings that they used to give us. The adults throwing chlorium all around the neighborhood, people closing off the lights in the home, and families being forced into some sort of military action and finding shelter in the neighborhood's bunker where we were supposed to survive in the case of an eventual bacteriological attack.
The Albanian fear of invasion dates back to the end of the Second World War. In 1945, much of Europe lay in ashes, torn apart by 6 years of total war. Albania had suffered occupation by both fascist Italy and Nazi Germany.
In many ways, the crushing defeats and humiliation in World War II profoundly influenced the direction the country would take in the post-war era.
Out of the fight for independence, one man emerged as the country's dictator, Enver Hoxha. Despite being supported by British and American intelligence services during the war, Hoxha was a staunch communist and quickly aligned himself with the Soviet Union.
Hoxha idealized Joseph Stalin. In fact, the Albanian communists, they were the only communist groups that openly supported Stalin. After his fall from grace,
Hoxha's dogmatic attachment to Stalin meant that when the Soviet dictator died in 1953, he severed ties with his successor, the more pragmatic Nikita Khrushchev.
Khrushchev wanted to lighten the heavy effects of the Stalin reign, and Hoxha of Albania thought that this was betraying the true communist ideal.
Hoxha could now add the USSR to his long list of enemies. In his increasing isolation, Hoxha's fear of invasion mounted, and his paranoia pushed him to initiate his bunkerization program.
The bunkerization of Albania was built on this siege mentality. The idea that enemies are everywhere, ready to strike at any time.
There could be as many as 700,000 bunkers in Albania, one for every 4 people. And they weren't all mushrooms. Hoxha reserved the biggest for himself, and it's found beneath the capital, Tirana.
Now we're in a completely different kind of bunker. This monster going 5 floors under the ground, being equipped with 106 rooms, was supposed to protect Hoxha and the communist leaders. And that included also the whole directors of the army. They needed to be secured here against any nuclear, chemical, or bacteriological attack.
It was a monumental undertaking, and the tiny Albanian nation wasn't able to complete Hoxha's maniacal bunkerization program alone.
Every now and again, on some of the instruments deep in these bunkers, you catch a glimpse of a clue that tells you who was behind all this.
Hoxha had got into bed with a dangerous ally.
Hoxha was a true ideologue and a true believer, and so he turned to a purer form of communism, which they saw in Mao's China.
Relations with other Eastern Bloc nations were increasingly strained, and Hoxha's alliance with China was not well received. During the 1970s, Albania stepped up bunker production to stave off the perceived threat of invasion. Hoxha had convinced his nation that neighbors such as Italy, Greece, or Yugoslavia, as well as nuclear powers such as America and the Soviet Union, were on the brink of attacking them. Their only ally, China, poured industrial resources into the small country. At its core was this: the metallurgical factory complex at Elbasan.
Framed by these beautiful mountains in the background, you have a man-made environmental disaster zone. There's chimneys, there's factories, there's buildings and all sorts of different states of repair.
More than 500 of these giant buildings were constructed, accompanied by all the infrastructure a complex of this scale would require.
Giant molds allowed prefabricated bunker parts to be fitted together like a jigsaw.
You can barely imagine the amount of noise and smoke that must have emanated from this place.
The metal and concrete factories in the industrial zone sped up the production of bunkers, which were rolled out across the nation.
But at the same time, the housing was neglected. The rest of the infrastructure in the country was falling behind, all at the expense of the bunkerization program.
Domestic issues were soon exacerbated by international developments. A pivotal moment in Sino-American relations threatened Hoxha's rigid allegiance to communist doctrine.
First Kissinger, then President Nixon were allowed to visit China. That was all too much for Hoxha, and to him, a sign of China's new revisionist direction.
Chairman Mao died in 1976, and thawing relations culminated with the Chinese breaking off trade with Albania 2 years later.
First it was the Soviets, then the Chinese. He was falling out with the very powerhouses that were bankrolling Albania.
It practically transformed Albania into what North Korea stands today to the world. This was the most isolated country in Europe.
After Hoxha's death in 1985, the regime clung on. But the people were getting wind of communist collapse across Eastern Europe.
First you had hunger strikes by students, then the people rose up and took to the streets. They'd had enough.
Albania's Marxist-Leninist government fell in 1991, leaving behind this bizarre legacy. Hundreds of thousands of bunkers left to decay. Today, the many bunkers are being repurposed.
Albania is trying to build this future and image as a tourism destination, and is doing quite a good job. Eventually, they will host capitalist visitors, and there will be no better punishment for the dictatorship.
And Albania is now looking outwards as a candidate to join the European Union.
Albania, for sure, is very enthusiastic about integrating the EU. This is the big brother that we've probably been dreaming, and it's for us like going back home somehow. Being a member of the big European family is like really finding out the parents which we lost many centuries ago.
On America's eastern seaboard, in Delaware, the drifting sand dunes reveal a collection of threatening structures.
The east coast of the U.S. is famous for beautiful beaches. You have people picnicking, you have surf crashing. You could just be out for a day on the beach.
Then, in amongst the dunes and the scrub pines, you catch glimpses of something that looks completely out of place.
Closer inspection reveals a clear military purpose.
You see remnants of bunkers and these concrete towers. It's really incongruous because you're on this lovely beach where, as far as most of us know, there's never been any kind of a war.
In fact, war did come to these shores, one that would claim thousands of lives. On the eastern shores of the United States in Delaware, there are distinct signs that heavy artillery was once deployed here.
This long, dark corridor cuts through the center of this huge bunker, and old rusty chains hang from rails. This was clearly used for hoisting something of significant weight.
Outside, abandoned weaponry still lurks behind the dunes. Like everything else at this site, these guns face out to sea.
But who were they afraid of? Who were they expecting to invade the eastern seaboard?
It might seem like the Americans were being paranoid. I mean, who's going to attack the U.S. on the Delaware Coast, the Jersey Shore?
In fact, an invasion did come. But would this facility be ready to meet the challenge? The desolate relics date back to the late 1930s. Few people know what went on here.
For a long time, their use and function was kept completely confidential.
Today, historians are keen to preserve these military monuments. And Dr. Gary Ray is leading the charge.
When the military built this base, this place became super secret, so you weren't allowed on the beach. The military put the word out that nothing was to be talked about. So what you're looking at here is America's first homeland security.
This is Fort Miles, a military complex guarding the mouth of the Delaware River.
We don't usually think of the Delaware as one of America's major rivers for shipping, but it does lead to a very important harbor in Philadelphia.
A naval shipyard, as well as arsenals and refineries preparing high-octane fuel for combat aircraft, were all located upriver.
This was a key defense place on the East Coast. This water behind me was just saturated with tankers.
So if a foreign power can get in and stop the traffic in and out of Delaware Bay, they've taken a great step toward victory.
The US military arrived at this 5,000-acre site and installed the first large artillery pieces in 1938, just over a year before the Second World War broke out in Europe.
Hitler fantasized about seeing New York City engulfed in flames.
Hitler used to talk about his dreams of seeing German long-range bombers attacking our coast. One of his more over-the-top concepts was that he might actually be able to do a land invasion of the U.S.
The threat was real. We thought the Germans were coming over the horizon, and we were preparing for them.
The layout of the site reflects how the US expected the Germans to attack, with their powerful, super-fast battleships. The observation towers were the first line of defense. Tyler Dreiblatt has been studying the site for years.
So this tower was here to spot for the big German battleships like the Bismarck and the Tirpitz. That's what we were worried about here at Fort Miles.
When construction began on these towers, the US had yet to enter the war. But they were sending cargo ships down the Delaware River and out across the Atlantic to support their ally, Great Britain.
After the fall of France in May-June 1940, Great Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. The Battle of the Atlantic was an attempt by the Americans to supply Great Britain despite the presence of the German fleet.
This was a tonnage war, and if Hitler could cut Britain off from her supplies, then victory would be within his grasp.
Heavy artillery that could fire miles out to sea protected the bay and the flow of traffic heading to Britain.
By late 42, early 43, the fort was ready to rock and roll.
Made of 100,000 tons of concrete, Battery 519 hides the jewel in the crown of this defense system.
This corridor cuts through the center of this huge bunker. Old rusty chains hang from rails. This rail leads you to this monstrous gun. When you see this, the towers start to make sense.
These lookout towers were intended to help the artillerymen find their targets better. They would take a shot, see where it landed, then the guys in the tower would say, 2 degrees right, 2 degrees left.
So this tower was one of 15 up and down the coast, all working together to target those enemy battleships.
The fort's smaller guns also required bomb-proof housing. This mighty structure is Battery Herring.
Herring was part of one of 4 batteries, and you can still see the turntables where the 6-inch guns would have sat.
You could fire a 6-inch gun, it fired a 100-pound shell. armor-piercing shell about once every 15 seconds. And so a blizzard of shells would start coming in on an enemy ship.
And with more artillery and fortifications installed 12 miles away on the other side of the Delaware Bay, Fort Miles was complete. Now the Americans believed they were ready to take whatever the Germans could throw at them.
A lot of military experts had their minds in their mentality that wars are fought between giant battleships bombarding things on land, giant forts on land bombarding the battleships.
Those ships are going to appear over the horizon to attack the east coast of the United States. So this fort was built to defend against them. The Germans, unfortunately, outfoxed us.
The problem was Germany didn't arrive with battleships.
The Germans arrived with something far more deadly that would soon claim thousands of American lives.
Just when this defensive system was completed, it suddenly became obsolete.
December 1941. Hitler declared war on the US and dispatched 5 state-of-the-art long-range U-boats to attack America's Atlantic coast. The stealth of Hitler's submarines had already caused devastation in European waters.
The Americans don't really have good sort of submarine sense. They're still thinking in terms of big fleet actions in the open sea, and they don't realize that these German submarine wolf packs are creeping right up to the American shore.
The lookout towers, designed to help aim the big guns, turned out to be basically useless against submarines.
The result was carnage. During World War II, Fort Miles had been built to protect Delaware Bay against Nazi attack, but they were not prepared for Hitler's state-of-the-art German U-boats.
During a 5-month period, over 600 US ships, totaling 3 million tons, were lost. Over 5,000 American sailors lost their lives.
18 of these ships sank in front of Fort Miles at the entrance of the Delaware Bay. In the interests of morale, US military chiefs may have wanted to keep this humiliating defeat secret.
But the locals knew something was happening out there because you could hear the explosions and see the flames at night. And then in the morning, you would see the oil and the flotsam that would come ashore. It was a disaster, the first order.
The German U-boat war against US shipping on our own coast was devastating.
The German admirals and submarine skippers referred to these early months of the Battle of the Atlantic as the happy time.
The Americans had to come up with a countermove fast. The curiously long jetty at Fort Miles was part of their response.
The decision was taken to deploy this enormous minefield across the mouth of Delaware Bay. 500 floating mines tethered to the seabed to stop any German submarines coming up the Delaware River.
The 6,000-pound mines were deployed in the deepest channel of the Delaware Bay, where submarines could lurk.
The mine wharf was 1,700 feet long, and it was out in deep water. And you had a minefield out in front. There was a huge cable that went across from the Delaware side to the New Jersey side, which blocked the mouth of the bay.
The men in this tower also worked together to spot ships moving into the bay, where they could make the decision to set off 1 mine, 15 mines, or all 455 that crossed all the way across the Delaware.
With the remotely detonated mines in place, Fort Miles was finally able to protect war supplies coming out of Delaware Bay. Until the 14th of May, 1945, when U-boat 858 surrendered at the pier, effectively marking the end of World War II for this region.
After the war, the German U-boats were replaced by Soviet submarines.
And when the Cold War ended, Fort Miles finally closed in 1991. Today, this dramatic facility is preserved as a museum. It serves as a stark reminder of just how real the Nazi threat to America was. In northeastern Spain, in the ancient province of Aragon, a cluster of buildings have been left high and dry.
This place used to be really civilized. There are balconies, a local watering hole, a beautiful great church.
You can see where people lived, where people worked, where people worshipped. The only thing you can't see is the people.
The old stone buildings are completely crumbling. The ceilings are really only being held up by half-rotten tree branches.
At first, there's little indication as to why this place was abandoned.
What kind of evacuation gives people the time to pack up all of their worldly goods and go down the road in hopes of building a future somewhere else?
Something about this site doesn't add up.
Northeast Spain is a pretty dry area, but there was water here, so it must have been an attractive place to live at some point. Why would anyone leave?
The people who had settled here had found a Garden of Eden, but someone with an even bigger stick wanted it.
It's a David and Goliath story, but this one doesn't have a happy ending.
This is the ancient village of Esco. For hundreds of years, it was a stopping point along the 1,000-mile pilgrimage route, the Camino de Santiago.
Thousands, millions of Christians would make the pilgrimage along this route, on foot. This place, Esco village, was a very welcome rest stop on that pilgrimage.
Esco lies in a rugged, mountainous region. Thanks to the pilgrims and the fruits of the land, it thrived well into the 20th century. Jose Luis Clemente remembers that time well. This was his childhood home.
This is where I was born. I was happy here. I lived here for 10 years. I remember it all very fondly. Years ago, these ruins we see now, they had a life of their own. There was a very strong community here. At the beginning of the last century, there were as many as 260 villages here.
Land suitable for growing crops is scarce here, limited to the narrow valley floor. But the relics of irrigation channels, terraces and orchards show the Esco farmers made the most of what they had. Farming was clearly at the center of village life.
People lived off the land. In these groves, they grew vegetables, fruit, all sorts of things.
The village of Esco blossomed by virtue of its geography.
This is a very dry part of Spain, but this particular region is well watered by runoff from the Pyrenees Mountains.
So for hundreds of thousands of years, this valley is nicely wetted by its favorable geology.
There was a water channel that brought water from the Esco River and that irrigated all the orchards.
But when Jose was just 10 years old, something happened to change this ancient way of farming. The very water that was the font of life for this village would ultimately strike its death knell. The mid-20th century was the height of the fascist dictator General Franco's reign. He led Spain's drive to modernize.
In the 1950s, Spain was beginning to rebuild itself after a series of crises: the Civil War, the Second World War, and the decision was made to modernize this part of Spain.
Spanish industry starts to develop, and there is more and more need for water, for farming, for drinking water in cities, for powering industry, and that water's got to come from somewhere. And you can't wait for the rains to come to run a modern industrial economy.
Esco sits in the Yerzur Valley, an oasis in a notoriously dry region. Here, snow melt and summer rains coursed downstream. It was a prime target for one of General Franco's ambitious water infrastructure schemes.
The decision was made to put a reservoir in the valley, which they did by damming the river that runs right through here.
In 1960, General Franco opened his prized Yerzur Dam. Towering almost 250 feet high, it created one of the largest reservoirs in the Pyrenees and flooded 2,500 hectares of land, including the precious fertile pastures of Esco. But General Franco's iron grip on the people of Spain meant speaking out was unthinkable.
There were no protests or anything because they were a political crime and simply not permitted. Here, the people were very straightforward, not cunning enough, and they did what they were told.
Esco itself wasn't flooded, so at first, Jose's family and the other villagers thought they could survive.
So the water starts to rise, their farmable land starts to shrink. Their breadbasket was becoming a bucket.
They tried to sustain themselves on the land they had left, but it simply wasn't enough to feed everyone.
Bit by bit, the villagers saw that their livelihoods were going under the surface of that lake.
The reservoir flooded all the richest lands. It wasn't enough for all the families to live on, so every one of them chose to leave and live somewhere else.
Water for these farmers was the stuff of life, and it was water that snuffed it out.
Today, Jose heads up the Esco Residents Association, which campaigns to get their land back. But their ultimate goal is to return home one day.
It takes one drop to start a waterfall. So, if I put down a stone, build a house, others will start to follow and build more houses, and the village will come back to life.
Spain has been a democracy a few years now, so now it might be possible for people to return and make new lives in their old village.
In Kawatana, in the far southwest of Japan, strange structures jut out into the bay.
When you see this area, it looks very peaceful. Wooded hills, lovely bays. It looks like maybe someplace you'd go on a yoga retreat.
But as tranquil as this place might first appear, in truth, it conceals a violent past.
As you head up one of the hills, you can see up to the peak, get the most amazing views out across the water. And that, I think, is the clue to what this place was for.
This is a very remote location. You don't see major towns, it's not a major port, you don't see a lot of other boats in the area. Whoever built these buildings had a reason to be as far away from other people as possible.
Were they doing something secret? Were they doing something dangerous? There are stories here in these buildings.
While few clues remain, this site was in fact connected to the deadly attack on Pearl Harbor. So what secret work took place here? And what role did it have on that fateful day? The peak of activity dates back to the Second World War.
74 years have passed since the war, but in Kawatana, there are many places like this left over from that time.
Murai Tatsumi is a volunteer guide in the area and first began exploring the site at a young age.
I happened to be born here and grew up around here, so this was a good area to play in. But it used to be like an overgrown forest here. Nobody really knew what those buildings originally were.
While the history of the site was neglected for years, from its earliest days at the end of the First World War, this location played a vital role in improving Japan's naval capabilities.
I think today, many people don't realize just how powerful Japan was in the first half of the 20th century.
It had taken over territory on the Chinese mainland, it had taken over a number of formerly German island groups in the Pacific, and they were needing bigger and bigger, more sophisticated naval facilities for this big ocean-going fleet that was going to protect this growing Japanese empire.
The unique features, still visible today, betray the specific purpose of this facility.
The key thing about this area is the pier, and more importantly, that section at the end, the cutout section. This site is all about the water, but we're not looking at ships or vessels here. It's all about weapons.
This was the location Japan used to test new torpedo designs.
This is the Katashima Torpedo Test Site. Situated on the shore of Amura Bay, a large inland body of water, the Japanese Navy had found a quiet and secure position to advance their weapons program. But how would this site go on to play a devastating role in drawing the US into battle?
Here are the marks from where the minecart rails used to be. They'd put the torpedoes in a minecart and then bring them here. And then here, there was probably a crane. They'd put the torpedo on the crane and lower it 3 to 5 meters under the water. They'd aim it at a target 2 kilometers away and fire it from here.
So the whole of the infrastructure here is aiming at one thing, and that's testing torpedoes. You have to be able to track the thing. And that's where we've got the whole tower up on the hillside.
We can see the observation platforms where the naval officers testing the torpedoes would watch them run across the water and note down observations about route, speed, direction, velocity, all that kind of stuff.
You've had spotters out on boats as well. A risky business, because those torpedoes didn't always go where they thought they were going to.
Testing a facility like this, they were doing a dry run with all of their various torpedo technologies, testing the various fuses, testing how it would run at certain depths, testing of whether it would explode on impact or if the fuse would explode near the hull of the enemy ship.
Throughout the 1930s, Japan used torpedoes in pursuit of its expansionist aims. But to perfect their weapon of choice, the land-based facilities were just as vital.
Here you can see a channel. This must be the waterway. There are water pools for industrial water next to it. Over here, we think there were machines for processing.
Little evidence remained to determine exactly how this place ran and the full extent of the work carried out here. But Tatsumi is certain of this building's importance to the project.
To fire torpedoes, you have to use air to burn the fuel. So in this room, the compressed air was put into the torpedoes. This was the most important part of the preparations.
After years spent perfecting their weapon, on the horizon was Japan's greatest challenge yet, an attack on the US Navy. To help prepare them, a specific model of torpedo was tested numerous times here, the Type 91.
This was a torpedo designed to be dropped from airplanes. They specifically modified it to work in shallow water because they had a target in mind. They wanted to use it for the big attack they were planning on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii.
Following the successful attack in 1941, Japan continued with its torpedo campaign across the Pacific theater.
Japan's focus on developing torpedo technology was very smart because at this time, many naval experts were still thinking about battleships as the primary weapon of war. And battleships, in fact, were almost obsolete by then.
Their strategy was to kind of draw the Americans across the broad Pacific and whittle down the strength of the American fleet by taking out their big battleships and aircraft carriers with torpedoes.
The vast majority of ships sunk in the Pacific during the war were sunk by torpedoes, whether fired from other ships, from submarines, or dropped from airplanes.
With a renewed interest in this weapon, the site here began to expand as investment flowed in. Reclaiming land from the water to turn the island into a peninsula and expanding the facilities upwards and outwards. Marooned in the water lies the remains of what was intended to be the next step.
Torpedoes were believed to be the best weapon in the world at the time. Japan wasn't thinking about losing the war at all, so they need to mass produce. And they built a factory here, which was the largest one in the country.
The pace of engineering advancing during the Second World War was phenomenal. And this extra building was for targeting torpedoes. It was for research into cutting-edge sonar technology.
This building is called Investigating Receipt Test Site. It was a testing facility for sonar to help accurately determine the enemy warship's location and distance. We don't have any records of tests here, because just after 2 years of building the site, the war ended. So we think this was all for nothing.
On August the 9th, 1945, the atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, less than 20 miles away. Within days, the Japanese surrendered, and this entire site has lain deserted ever since.
Now we put emphasis on the war as something we shouldn't repeat again. And to keep the peace, we want people to come and see this place and think about it carefully.
Abandoned, disintegrating, reclaimed by nature. Structures once at the cutting edge, bearing witness to the forces, pioneers, and villains that define the world today. Emblems of a shared past, still standing in our present.